Recently, Seeker threw a party at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco to investigate and celebrate the future of humanity. We had robotic exoskeleton suits, futuristic foods, we talked Blade Runner and replicants. You should join us next time. We really know how to party. I was lucky enough to sit down for a one-on-one interview with Dr. Liz Warren from the ISS National Lab. She filled us in on all of the amazing science currently being done on the International Space Station and let us know why that's important to the future of, well, us. I had such a great time talking to her, and I wanted to share this experience with the Seeker audience. My name is Maren Hunsberger. I write and I host for Seeker, and tonight's theme is Beyond Human, so exploring the future of humanity as we move forward into an uncertain age, what is gonna happen to our food, our technology, our medicine, those kinds of things. So we have with us tonight Dr. Liz Warren, who works at the Center for Advancement of Science in Space, or CASIS, and she's uniquely positioned to talk to us about this tonight because much of her research takes place on the International Space Station. So we're going to dive into that a little bit. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Warren. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Warren this evening. So let's start talking about CASIS, Center for Advancement of Science in Space, and the International Space Station, the ISS. Can you introduce us a little bit to the science that's going on there?
Well, absolutely. First, let me tell you about your International Space Station. It is an absolutely amazing place. It is in orbit right now. People have been living there, not the same people, for we're coming up on 20 years now, and it's about the size of a football field. It weighs close to 1 million pounds, and it is a world-class laboratory. We're doing research there that will help NASA explore further in space. And also, we're doing research there that benefits life here on Earth.
Ooh, like what?
well, so we've got astronauts living there, and they generally stay there for about 6 months at a time. And they rotate through, so people don't all leave at the same time. They rotate in basically crews of 3. And while the astronauts are there, they work on a variety of science experiments. Of course, a lot of times they're just keeping the space station running as well. It's a ship that has to sail, and so you've got to do a lot of maintenance work. But we do research there in biology and biotechnology, Earth remote sensing, so we're doing a lot of time studying the Earth itself. We're doing research in physical sciences, combustion, fluid physics, kind of fundamental physics. We're also doing a lot of technology demonstration and development, testing new materials. And we do a lot of research on the astronauts themselves, human research.
I was going to ask, because they're in space for a long time, and space is obviously very different from Earth. So what happens to the human body while in space, and how are we studying that?
So probably a few of you have heard of some of the effects of living in space on the human body. And the one that most people are familiar with is bone loss. Without the pull of gravity, that's a force that's constantly on our bodies. Without that constant force, our bodies neglect our bones. It neglects our muscles, our cardiovascular systems. There's also changes in our immune system, becomes less effective. All of these changes actually are pretty similar to aging on Earth. People, as they age, lose bone mass, lose muscle mass, lose cardiovascular fitness, and have immune issues. So a lot of what we learn about studying humans in space is actually pretty applicable to all of us here on Earth, especially with regard to aging.
Wow. So what kinds of things are we measuring about the astronauts while they're up there? What are we learning about the aging process, and where is that sort of taking us as we design for the future?
Well, there's a couple of things. If we just take bone loss, for example, we're very interested in maintaining astronauts' bones while they're in space. We're also interested in maintaining our bones here on Earth. Osteoporosis is a pretty significant disease. 70 million Americans suffer from osteoporosis, but it's a worldwide issue. And breaking a bone is not necessarily going to kill you if you have osteoporosis, but a lot of times people will fall, break a hip, end up in the hospital, and that begins a decline. And it can be a really unfortunate outcome of a simple trip and fall. And so we're trying to understand the mechanisms of why do the bones get weaker? Why is this happening? And in space, we, of course, want to keep our astronauts healthy while they're voyaging to destinations, exploration destinations, such as the moon or Mars. And if we can figure out how to keep astronauts' bones healthy, which we're actually getting pretty close to, if we can figure that out, maybe we can apply that knowledge, understanding the mechanisms of osteoporosis here on Earth. That's one example.
I love that example. And we're tending to keep astronauts healthy. I've seen lots of pictures of astronauts on special treadmills in space. Is that one of the ways that we're doing that for them?
Yes. So how do we keep astronauts' bones healthy in space? Or how do we keep astronauts healthy in space, period? They're in space for 6 months. Exercise and nutrition, the same things that are really important for us here on Earth, become even more important on Earth or in space. And so our astronauts have very specialized exercise equipment that include a treadmill, but it's not your standard treadmill. If you were to run on a treadmill in space, you would put your foot down and float up to the top. You'd bounce right off. So the space station treadmill has basically a backpack harness and bungee, and you bungee yourself to the surface of the treadmill. We've also got a stationary bike and something called the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device.
Fancy.
At NASA, we call it ARED. We really like acronyms. And ARED is kind of like a machine that you can dial in a certain amount of load into. It's essentially a load or a resistance exercise device. And we have found that if astronauts exercise for about 2 hours a day, high intensity, like pretty high intensity exercise, and they eat enough calories, we also give them some supplemental vitamin D, their bones are coming back in pretty good shape.
That is really good to hear. That's a lot of fitness, if you ask me. I'm a little too lazy for that. But so the environment that we're talking about here on the International Space Station is microgravity, yes, and I know that that's a very unique research environment. So what are the other research experiments that we're doing in microgravity that really benefit from being in that specific environment?
Well, there are so many, but microgravity itself, to a scientist, is like it's like looking at your science through an absolutely new lens. It changes just about everything. And it's actually really fun to talk to a scientist, an expert in their field, and ask them a question. Have you ever considered doing this experiment in space? And many of them have, but many of them, their first inkling is, nah, why would I do that? And then you start talking about, well, there's no convection in space. Hot air doesn't rise, hot fluids don't rise. There's no but all the diffusion that occurs, such as around a cell, is all standard Brownian motion. There's no stirring of fluids due to convection. Same thing with combustion. A candle drop or a candle flame doesn't look like a teardrop like it does here on Earth. Candle flame would actually look like a sphere. Fundamental fluid physics. What does water really want to do? When you spill water on a tabletop, it stays together in kind of a blob-like form. That's all due to hydrogen bonds and
surface tension.
Those forces are really, really weak, but they still are hanging on with gravity. When you remove gravity from the equation, it absolutely changes combustion, fluid physics. The water and the fire form spheres. This gives us a really unique insight to study things like cell biology and cancer. There's a study going on in the space station right now by a small company in Massachusetts. They're an innovative startup company. They got some funding to do research on the space station, and there's a video out about it right now. I think Seeker put one out. And it is about studying endothelial cells. Those are the cells that line our blood vessels. And this company has designed a drug or pharmaceutical to target those cells and wipe them out. Why? Well, if you find a cancer and you can stop its blood flow, you will eliminate that cancer. So they're looking how to do that. Why space?
Why
though?
space?
Right.
That's the question.
This is the question. So endothelial cells, if you grow them on Earth in a petri dish, they aren't quite like the endothelial cells in your body. There's some differences.
Because they're not in that environment.
They're
They're
not
not in situ. They're not in your blood vessel. So they act very differently.
They act very differently. In microgravity, in space, on the International Space Station, those cells behave more like they do in a human body.
Wow, so it's almost more effective. It's a better environment for them to grow in if we've got this experimental microgravity environment on the ISS. That's amazing. So I want to circle back to this. We have a follow-up question about that specific science. But I know you also earlier mentioned that it's our International Space Station. And why is that? So what does the general public have a role to play in the research that's going on in the ISS?
Well, so the International Space Station was built by international partners. The portion of the International Space Station that is the United States portion is a national laboratory. It's designated as a national laboratory, and that means that it is open to researchers all across the United States, which may be in academia at a university. They may be at a small startup company like the NGX, the cancer therapy that I just mentioned. They could be a really large company. The important part is it's open to everyone, and even high school students are doing research experiments on the space station.
That's amazing.
And kind of the caveat is it must benefit life here on Earth to be a national lab experiment.
That's incredible. So any of you out in the audience could submit a research proposal to do research on the ISS. Just get thinking. So one of those projects that I'm particularly interested in is with a technology called organ on a chip. That sounds fascinating to me. It's basically replicating a biological organ in a tiny microfluidics device. Can you tell us more about that?
So this is a new area of science that I'm really excited about. It's kind of just getting off the ground here on Earth. It's kind of a pun. And it's very...
Science really out of this world, guys. Space puns.
It really is. So what is an organ on a chip? It sounds like, what are we talking about
Total
here?
science fiction. Potato chip, computer chip, like, what are we talking about?
So it's closer to a computer chip than a potato chip, but maybe not so much. So imagine something about the size of a credit card or a thumb drive, and it's made of plastic, but kind of a biologically friendly plastic. And within that chip, there are little channels. We call them, it's basically a microphysiological system. And this chip is lined with human cells. They may be stem cell derived liver cells, cardiac cells. Basically, they use some of your cells from your blood, for example, revert those cells to stem cells, reprogram those stem cells to be whatever tissue of choice that we're talking about. Brain, liver, cancer, heart, not cancer, GI tract. But
cancer in the GI tract?
We actually do have a cancer on a chip as well. And these chips recapitulate, or they mimic, the behavior of a human organ better than cell culture in a petri dish that we mentioned before, even better than lab animals.
Wow, and so that's a big deal because these organs on a chip, even when you're using them on Earth, but even more so in microgravity in space, could help us move beyond animal testing for things like drugs, for understanding cancer. So that's a big step forward in that field as well. My next question about that is so our big challenge here on Earth is not only replicating the situation in the body, but also that connectivity. So with the organ on a chip, is there a possibility to eventually maybe put all those organs together and make a human body on a chip?
Right. So what we've got today is we have maybe a liver on a chip and a heart on a chip. And how do we connect them together? And can we actually string them together so that there's a human body, essentially, being recreated, mimicked? And we are doing that. And when I say we, I mean like the greater scientific community.
Sure.
A lot of this research is being sponsored by the NIH, in particular NCATS. They're basically in charge of translating fundamental science to the clinic. Basically trying to move basic science quicker through the system to become something that is used in the pharmaceutical industry and in the clinic. And by basically linking chips together to be a human on a chip, then that really opens up the possibilities.
Wow, that's incredible. So we're talking right now about the ISS, and in particular, science in the national interest sponsored by the national government. But in the next few years, we're going to be seeing more commercial space flight. And so how do you see things like Blue Origin, things like people, just regular, ordinary citizens paying to go up into space? Where do you see that going in the future, and where does this research come into play for how we plan that and how we make it safe?
So you mentioned commercial spaceflight. So there are a number of companies that are interested in flying people like you and me to space for a couple of minutes.
For a couple $1 million.
It's a little cheaper than that, fortunately. But Blue Origin, for example, is interested in flying millions of people. That's kind of their business goal. And it's kind of a strange concept to think about, but really they just want to open up space to anybody. This kind of goes back to the tissue chips. If we want to be able to send everybody into space, we want to make sure that it's not going to affect anybody differently that may have an adverse effect or an adverse response to space. And so tissue chips are another way of basically pushing the boundaries and learning more. You mentioned the pharmaceutical industry. Today, to take a prescription medication that you've got, this medication is safe. The FDA has done a lot of testing. It's taken years and years and billions of dollars to get that medication to be something that is okay for you to take. The FDA is interested in making that process a little bit faster. Just as safe, they don't want to cut any corners, they just want to be more efficient. We mentioned lab animals and tissue culture and clinical trials. All of that takes a lot of time and a lot of expense. These tissue chips could actually make this process a little bit faster, or actually, hopefully, a lot faster.
And hopefully model it a little more accurately than a non-human animal or in a petri dish.
Absolutely.
So we've got myriad benefits from this science happening in space. Not only does it model it more accurately, makes us less likely to need to use animal models, and will hopefully speed up maybe the drug development and drug discovery process.
Absolutely.
Very cool. So the theme of tonight is, of course, beyond human, looking forward into the future. So this already kind of sounds futuristic to me, but it's happening now. What are some of your favorite experiments that you see coming up in the next couple of years, things that you're excited for in the future as this field moves forward?
At the beginning of next year, we're launching a 3D bioprinter to the space station.
Whoa.
So probably everyone's heard of 3D printers by now, right? They're layer by layer, usually plastic, put together. It's basically additive manufacturing. It's lay down a layer, lay down another layer on top of that, and another layer on top of that, and you can build a structure. Well, we're interested in doing that with biological tissue. And you can do this on Earth, but there's a limit. When we 3D print tissue, well, first of all, let's be clear. What can this be used for? Why would we 3D print a tissue?
I'm thinking you could 3D print organs.
You can 3D print organs, or if you've got a wound that you need to put a cover on, and you can 3D print tissues. I know a lot of people have seen articles coming out of even animals that are getting burned in some of these terrible forest fires. You've seen the bears and the cougars with the tilapia, the fish scale, basically bandages. What if we were able to just replace that burned tissue with new tissue? That's pretty cool. We're doing, so you can 3D print tissues and organs, potentially. Why do it in space, though? Again, that question.
Good question.
Why
space?
Well, we can do it on Earth, but we have a limit, like I mentioned, of about 1 centimeter. And once you get a little bit beyond 1 centimeter, the tissue starts to not do so well because there's not enough time for vascularization. That's new blood vessels and arteries and veins to be growing into the tissue.
And because they're working against gravity because they have to grow up.
Well, yes, and by doing additive manufacturing in microgravity, you don't have that constant pressure and basically the tissue is collapsing on itself on Earth, and it won't happen like that in microgravity. So there's great potential there of, and again, we could take your blood, revert your blood into your stem cells, bring those stem cells to space, 3D print you a new organ, grow it up there, make it nice and healthy for you, and bring it back on Earth. Now, I don't want to make any promises that I can't keep.
Sure.
this technology, we're
talking about the
years.
future here. We're talking about the future.
And its potential, and there's a lot of challenges and a lot of barriers that need to be overcome before this is a reality, but it could happen.
We've got to have goals. We've got to have somewhere to go, right?
You've got to have goals.
Not only could we potentially reproduce human organs, so that sort of helps us with our problem of organ donation, but we could also do it in space, which would be a little insane to me. Not only do you have a new organ, but it was made in space. That's fine. So we talked a little bit about the science of aging and understanding how that happens to people here on Earth. And we're talking about how the science on the International Space Station has to be in the benefit of people here on Earth. What are some other examples of that?
I really liked an interesting experiment that we did with stem cells. I've mentioned them a couple of times. So stem cells can be used to treat a variety of maladies here on Earth, but they're pretty hard to grow on Earth. They kind of tend to replicate a little bit too quickly, and we like to keep stem cells young or nascent so that they don't divide and become a cell that we don't want them to be. We want them to stay nice and young. And we don't really have a good way of doing that on Earth. And you need to grow millions, maybe billions of cells to make something that is actually effective to treat a person. And we just don't have a way of doing that very well. Someone along the way hypothesized maybe these cells would grow better in space, and maybe they would stay young and nascent if we grew them in space. And some preliminary experiments have shown that. So it may be that we use space simply just to grow stem cells, keep them nice and healthy, grow a lot of them, keep them young, and then bring them back down to treat a variety of maladies here on Earth.
That's amazing. Yeah, there are myriad challenges with stem cell therapy, not only here on Earth, but in space as well. And actually we have many videos on Seeker. One of the videos on Seeker is about stem cells and stem cell therapy, so go check that out on YouTube if you'd like. So Dr. Warren, I know that your background is in physiology primarily. How did you personally get interested in conducting this kind of research in space?
So it's a little bit of a long story, but as I said, I grew up in the Bay Area here, just in Marin County, and I knew that I really liked NASA and airplanes and space, but I really liked biology. And again, coming to a place like this, when you're a kid, it keeps your inquisitive nature going. It's like, why does that animal look different than that animal? And why do they both exist? And do they eat the same thing? Probably not, because they look different and form follows function. That was a really important lesson in physiology. And so you foster all of these interests. I went to school, I graduated from Tamalpais High School. At that point, I already knew that I was going to be a space physiologist.
Whoa.
And I knew that because my neighbor, Millie Hughes Fulford, was actually selected to be an astronaut payload specialist. And she lived just in Mill Valley, actually. And this was back in 1991. She was selected to fly on a space shuttle mission totally dedicated to life sciences research in space. And had I not learned about that possibility, I don't know exactly when I would have found it, but I found it in high school. So I found my passion. That's what I'm going to do.
Exactly. So you had that role model. You had a specific example of what you wanted to pursue. Now I want to return a little bit. One of my personal passions is immunology and disease. I think that's fascinating. Why does the immune system suffer in space? And how are we studying? Are we studying any diseases up there? Are we studying how the human body reacts to viruses? What are we doing up there with disease and germs?
So you need to propose an experiment to study virus activation in space, because we haven't studied a whole lot about this, and it's a little bit of a quandary. We don't fully understand why the immune system does not work very well in space. For example, if all of us went to space, those of us with allergies, you might miraculously become allergy-free. Those of us with no allergies, you might suddenly become allergic to something.
Oh dear.
That's very strange. We know that T cell activation, the white blood cells in our body that mount a response to an invader, is diminished. They don't mount the same response. So there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered. And again, potentially by answering or understanding what's happening in space in a dysfunctional model, that helps us understand how to make things work here on Earth better. So we can maybe address immune dysfunction on Earth.
That just blows my mind. I can't believe it because it's so different up there. I can't believe that those things are directly applicable and are sometimes a better model. That is my favorite thing in the whole world. So my last question for you, Dr. Warren, is you mentioned the questions or the challenges that come up with that kind of, they have unique pros, but what are some of the cons? So what holds us back in studying science and space? And if some of those challenges were taken away, where could we go? What could we do?
Well, some of the hard things about doing science in space is the very things that make science in space cool, fluids. And this is one of our concerns for these tissue chips that we're sending to space. I mentioned those little microfluidic channels that are lined with cells. If a bubble gets in one of those little fluid lines, it's really hard to get out. If you are working on Earth and there's a bubble in your system, all you have to do is wiggle whatever you're working with. The bubble will find its way out the top. That does not happen on Earth, or in space.
In space, sure.
So it poses a potential quandary. But really, if you kind of take away some of those boundaries and take away some of the challenges, the possibilities are really limitless. And that is really what excites me as a scientist as well. It's like, you have a question. Probably everyone in this room has a question that could probably benefit from being done in space. And that's really cool. That's really neat as a scientist.
I love that. I think that's an excellent note to end on, is that research in space is limitless. We all have questions. You can go to CASIS and submit a question. You can ask them what they're doing. You can ask them all about their research. You could submit a proposal, and that's one of my favorite things. So let's thank Dr. Warren for joining us this evening.
Thanks so much for watching. I love being able to talk to these brilliant, amazing scientists. So let me know in the comments who you think I should interview next. And if you want to see more about the ISS National Lab, click on this video here about what it takes to get your science experiment to space.